Seeing Dark, Deconstructing Darkness, in which is said that darkness does not exist in a void, but requires a context. All was dark, dark only, alone, lying in dark silence, and all was peace. Galileo started at the night sky, the way he used to do as a young man. His mind was free. There was just dark, dark extending everywhere. Dark as far as he could see, nothing else. No moon, no stars, no planets. Unwittingly, slowly, his mouth murmured the very word dark. But Galileo's peace was brief. Dark in its purity was shattered, pierced by questions and doubts. What was going on in his brain when he saw dark? Which arguments among neurons were responsible for his experience? Could he now picture it, envision his brain and see what seed was needed for experience to be born? Could he now understand how dark, pure dark, truly came about? A map is but a scanty thing. Colored maps instead of continents, mountains flattened, great cities lost but for their name, measure replacing motion, and temperature heat, all detail gone, no life inside. The world exceeds all description. Events are far too dense for history. Of all the maps, of all the models, that of the brain, even one crafted by a master of miniatures, full of intricate features, was a model twice dead. Dead because it was merely a model, a weary simulacrum of reality, and dead because it was inanimate, yet what it modelled had a soul. Even if its gears had cranked to life, its soul would have been missing. Galileo was studying it anew, the shiny dome of the brain, trying to peek inside, consulting the books Frick had left him. What had he learned? Had he understood what it means to see? How an inner light penetrates the castle of the brain. His hand slid over its regions and felt the ceaseless whisper of neurons on the inside. So he pictured a wave of neural firing, starting at the back of the eye and traveling all the way up to the highest visual areas of the cortex, near the top of the brain. There, as Frick had told him, the wave of firing induced by the dark sky would trigger a final burst of firing in a few select cells, the very ones that were specialized to signal darkness. Those were the cells that fired whenever we saw dark consciously, even if we just dreamed of dark, that never fired when we did not see dark, and without which, if they were damaged, we couldn't even imagine what dark looked like. Galileo pictured the cells nearby, which were specialized to fire for light rather than for dark. They were completely silent, because there was no light to see. Other cells, not far away, which signaled blue or red or green colored patches, those were silent too, because all there was to see was an immense dark expanse. And cells detecting simple things, such as edges or bars, some vertical, some horizontal and some oblique, some for edges in the center of the field of view, some to the right or left, they remained silent too, since what they liked was absent. So were cells elsewhere in the visual areas, cells specialized for detecting shapes, such as rectangles or circles, because there were no shapes to be seen. So were cells specialized in detecting faces, because there were no faces, or cells specialized in detecting objects that moved because nothing moved. And in other parts of the cerebral cortex too, there was but little activity. There was no burst of firing in the auditory cortex, because there was nothing to hear. None in the parts of the brain specialized for touching or tasting or smelling, because there was nothing to touch, taste or smell, nothing to feel and nothing to think of. Finally, he pictured how these neuronal elements, distributed across many areas of the brain, were linked by myriads of interconnected mechanisms and formed a great complex, a single integrated entity that worked as a whole, and it was maximally irreducible, a complex of high phi. Perhaps he could see it happen now, when he, Galileo, had seen pure darkness. The intricate mechanisms of this large complex had ruled out, in various combinations, trillions of possible states that could not have led to its present firing pattern, all neurons silent save for a few exited by darkness, and in ruling out those incompatible states, they had generated a large amount of integrated information. Now he understood, he thought. Inside the cerebrum was a single large complex of Phi, but not elsewhere in the brain. He pictured the buzzing neurons in the cerebellum, in the brainstem, the spinal cord, and many other places. This buzzing was immaterial to his consciousness. This fire never fired with a spark of his own experience, not because these other neurons were different or weaker, but because they were not privileged. They were not part of the majestic complex that reigned over his brain. So cells in the retina, though they too had been firing in the dark, did not contribute to his experience. They merely ensured that the right set of cells high up in the brain, the privileged dark members of the corticothalamic complex, would themselves fire. So many other cells, confined inside innumerable provincial circles, in the cortex and underneath, like those that had made him speak unwittingly the word dark, were forever excluded from entering his consciousness. And so the circuits in the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and the brainstem, the ones that maintained his posture, stabilized his gaze, and controlled his blood pressure, were active day and night, fatiguing under the burden of their ceaseless tasks. But they would never be part of the vast cerebral complex, the great resplendent castle. Their lot broke down into small, dark hamlets, mired in local arguments, their Phi miserably low. They were outcasts, never to be admitted to the magnificent hall where the rich, harmonious society of the castle was assembled perpetually, where all important news was received and discussed, all plans were formulated and all decisions made. Outside, traders and workers and serfs went on in scores dispatching their menial labors, and heard none of the news, knew not the plans, and had no say. Yet relentlessly they supported the castle. Without them it would soon cease to exist. Not even the simplest task could be carried out without the tireless diligence of the outcasts. So now and then a dignitary would stand up and approach a small door near his seat and lend his ear through a porthole, perhaps issue in return some hushed order that nobody else could hear. A messenger would rush forth and whip the assignment into completion, perhaps return to the closed door to report and hear perhaps another order, but never, never would the messenger or the serfs partake of what was happening in the great hall. No whiff of that ethereal society transpired. All the serfs knew were mere reflections, indirect ripples of the great sea. When Galileo awoke from his reverie of understanding, he was not enlightened but shivering in doubt. He saw it all again in rapid sequence. He saw the brain, the vast cerebral complex within it. He saw its neurons firing, and complexes and repertoires, and he saw Phi. But there was an objection, as fatal as it was simple. Surely all he had thought was important to consciousness, perhaps essential, integrated information, the complex of flickering neurons. Yet, just as surely, why should any of this, a complex of flickering neurons, ever give rise to experience? Why should integrated information acquire a subjective side and become experience? Worse, it seemed to him that N was right. There was no way to conceive how his complex of flickering neurons, flickering in that particular way, would give rise to that particular experience of pure darkness. No magic could wring his complex of flickering neurons and squeeze the juice of darkness out of it. No alchemy could make darkness out of neurons and their mechanisms. No mechanism could give darkness its special visual quality, its unique black quale. There is nothing, N had said, nothing that can explain why darkness looks the way it does, why dark is dark and light is light, why colors look different from shapes and different from the way music sounds, or pain feels, or a twang feels like a twang. There is nothing in matter that can explain the quality of mind. It was a foolish leap of faith, a leap that explained nothing. It all had been in vain. Galileo once more had been fooled by his fondest wishes. A fool he was, but if he was a fool, he was a proud one, and Galileo's pride burned and fired his wit. He saw the image of Salerno heating and cooling Ishmael's brain, and then he saw that it was not Ishmael's but Alciuri's, and it was not Salerno but himself, Galileo, and he was chilling it slowly, piece by piece, region by region, node by node. He was slowly going to erode Alciuri's brain, like Count Ugolino gnawing at the skull of the Archbishop of Pisa. Alciuri was there, staring toward the night sky, and all was dark, entirely dark. Just dark, dark extending everywhere. And then Galileo asked what would happen if he chilled the parts of Alciuri's brain that let him hear sounds. Would his experience of dark change at all? Alciuri's answer had come swiftly.
Not in the least. If there was silence before, there would still be silence. As long as there is no sound, how could I tell that I am deaf rather than there is no sound?
That would be true if I had chilled the inside of your ears, Galileo heard himself say. But having chilled the very parts of the brain that are responsible for your experience of sound, how would you know there is silence instead?
Are the absence of sound and the absence of hearing not the same thing?
Exclaimed Alciuri. Certainly not, Galileo had replied. Imagine I also chill those parts of your brain that let you smell, and those that let you taste flavors. Would anything change?
Again no, said Alciuri. There would be a difference only if there were an odour to smell, or something to taste.
So now I will chill those parts that allow you to see human faces.
Dark is not a face, said Alciuri.
And now, also those parts that are necessary to see any kind of shape, and those that make you see objects in motion.
Dark is yes dark, not a shape.
And finally, those nerve cells that are necessary to see blue and yellow and red and green, finished Galileo. Alciuri hesitated for an instant, and then he said that no, his perception of dark would stay the same. Of course, if a blue light had been turned on, an object had appeared, a face materialized, a bell had sounded. He would not have noticed. He would have just gone on seeing dark, but dark it was. When you say you see dark with your brain mostly chilled, do you mean exactly the same dark as when you say you see dark now? Was Galileo's next question.
Exactly the same,
said Alciuri without hesitating. But how would you know that dark is dark rather than a color, if you would not even know any more what color means?
Why would I need to know about color? If all I need to do is see dark, said Alciuri.
And how would you know that you are seeing rather than hearing something, if you cannot know what hearing means, nor smelling or tasting, insisted Galileo. But seeing that Alciuri would not answer, he told him he would now proceed to chill at last those cells he needed to see light. He would erode Alciuri's brain down to pure darkness. Alciuri hesitated longer.
I would still say that I see dark, as long as the parts of my brain that allow me to speak are not chilled, he finally said.
And what would you mean when you say that you see dark? You would not even know that dark is the opposite of light, let alone that it is not a color, not a visual object, not a sound, a smell, a taste, a thought, a wish, a memory, or a feeling, said Galileo. You would know hardly anything at all, and you would be hardly anything at all. You would generate one bit of information, a photodiode. That's what you would be like. Staring at Alciuri, who was silent, Galileo went on. This is what is difficult, the problem that is hard. When you see dark, you think you see just that, dark. You think you see something that comes already labeled, and all you need to do is watch it, to see it is dark. Darkness, you think, is something that's out there. It's darkness ready-made, and all you need to do is see it. You do not have to build it, compare it to anything else, to know indeed that it is dark. And certainly, to see it is dark, you do not have to say to yourself, "What I see is not light, not blue, not red, not a ripe apple, not Pisa, Padua or Rome, not a sound, not a feeling. This is none of the countless scenes I might experience." In fact, you need not go through any of those experiences, nor would you have enough time to do so, even if you were to count one each second and spend 1,000 times your life doing so. This is the trick that consciousness plays on you. Your experience of pure dark is given immediately, but in reality it can be dark only in relation to what it's not. And it is only if you have a brain that can distinguish darkness from untold other states, from each in a specific way, that you actually see dark. When the photodiode tells dark, that dark is empty, merely 1 out of 2. When you tell it's dark, it is 1 out of trillions, made what it is, special in its own special way, by how it differs from each and every one of the other trillions. Your dark is full, extraordinarily full as the most bustling market in the world. And then Alciuri began to see, and Galileo with him. He saw under Salerno's hands his own cerebral complex, and saw the neurons that, alone, were firing for dark. But they were not alone. The other, silent neurons of his cerebral complex, the quiet ones, they were required to give darkness its context, to put his black in context. Without those quiet ones, without their mechanisms spread out throughout the cerebrum, the darkness neurons were like humble photodiodes. To them, taken alone, the world was also made of 2, this way and not the other way, but was not made of dark and light. And then he saw Salerno loom over his complex and cut off its connections, shatter its mechanisms, first around the color cells high up, and when he did so, a small portion of the complex shrunk, and he saw his experience would shrink too. His dark would become less dark, because he did not know any more that dark lacked color. And then Salerno was madly breaking mechanisms, eroding the repertoire that could be distinguished, though all the notes were left in place. The dark one firing its burst of activity, and the others quiet but intact. All the connections severed. At that the complex collapsed and broke down into countless fragments. The great diamond had disintegrated, and then experience was shattered. Consciousness was shattered, its quantity annihilated, and its quality evaporated, and dark would be no more. Notes. Galileo imagines what his brain might be doing when he sees dark. In order to give concrete form to the intuitions he has developed about consciousness, starting with the photodiode thought experiment, Galileo's model of brain activity is extraordinarily crude, and his specific example questionable. It is not clear whether there are brain cells firing selectively for dark, though there are cells that fire in response to the overall brightness of a surface, and there certainly are cells that respond to a given color the way we do. For example, in visual areas V4/V8 of the cerebral cortex, there are cells that discharge every time we see blue and do not discharge when we do not see blue. If they are damaged, one cannot see blue, and one might add, if one electrically stimulate them, one would see blue even in complete darkness, which is not unlike what happens when we dream of blue or imagine it. Such cells are the scientist's best guess to the neural correlate of blue. As rough as Galileo's understanding of brain activity may be, his conclusion seems reasonable. To see dark, or blue, whatever, consciously, our brain must house a neural complex endowed with a large repertoire of distinguishable states. Instead, a photodiode specialized to signal dark, or blue, or whatever, would not see at all, whether it is a piece of electronics or the equivalent circuit in our brain.